And the fact is we're seeing drought, and I have farmers calling me on the way here. They're calling me and said, look, they say I've got enough moisture here. That's not true. It is worse than bone dry.
Welcome to the Louisiana Farm Bureau podcast. I'm Avery Davidson hosting this week. And right now, you really don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows, nor do you need a weatherman to know that it has been abnormally dry out there. It has been quite a while since we've had some rain. So that's why I brought people who are affected by rain and know about when it's going to rain, how it's going to rain, and all those sorts of things. Jay Grymes, State Climatologist. You're with both GOSEP and the LSU Ag Center. So it's a pleasure having you here on the podcast.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me, Avery.
And then Commissioner Mike Strain, Louisiana Commissioner of Agriculture and Forestry. I mean, I think that you've been dealing with weather in one form or another in every profession you've had.
I have, almost as long as Jay Grymes. You know, when he and I get together, something's always up.
Yeah, that's never a good thing.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
So it's a dangerous time here on the Louisiana Farm Bureau podcast. Jay, let's just go ahead and dive right in. How did we get to where we are, and what's the current situation?
Well, let's start with the current situation. Clearly, most of the state is in a drought, but it's not what we saw last year, at least not yet. And it's probably not going to get quite that bad. But what's really happened, once again, we've hit this pattern of dryness that started to kick in around August, rolled through September, except for, of course, a little tropical event in there. And then especially since about the first week of September, Mother Nature's really turned off the waterworks, except in the southeastern parishes. They're in pretty good shape from New Orleans southward, but just about the rest of the state is in some state of dryness, basically ranging from drought to even extreme drought in some locations.
So I know one of the ways in which we measure drought, or we look at the effects of drought, is through the U.S. Drought Monitor. How does that work? I mean, people see the map, but how does it get fed?
Well, keep in mind, drought means different things to different people. It's not just about rainfall, although clearly rain is the principal ingredient there. But we're also talking about things like temperatures, humidity, evapotranspiration, the rate at which the water evaporates. And so when we're talking about drought here, we're looking at all those factors. Soil moisture, how much moisture is stored in the soil at shallow depth and also at deeper layers. And so you've got to look at all of those together. So it's a complex issue. And what is one man's drought is another man's good for clearing the fields kind of situation. In this situation, though, we've clearly seen a lack of rainfall coupled with, in my opinion, unusually high evapotranspiration rates, unusually rapid loss of moisture out of the soils. And that's pushed us quickly into drought, especially when you consider that here we are September, October, and here deep into October, we're still dealing with almost summer-like temperatures. So it's been unusually warm, coupled with unusually dry, and that has prompted this drought situation.
And I'm going to point out that we're recording this on October 29th. There's been a little bit of rain that's come down in other parts of the state, not necessarily here, but Thursday there's expected to be about an inch of rain. But we're looking at already a 3-inch deficit in the Baton Rouge area just for October.
Just for the month, yeah. And now we have to be careful with that. And this is one of the reasons why there's so much confusion about the state of the drought. If we look at rainfall for Baton Rouge through the middle end of September, it's almost exactly normal for the year. And then we've hit this stretch now where it's been unusually dry. First half of the year was wet for most of the state. And that's one of the reasons why, for those folks that are looking closely at the Drought Monitor, you might be thinking, boy, it should be drier than that. Well, part of it is because the first part of the year was wet. So we're really looking at a short-term drought for most of the parishes.
And Commissioner Strain, we talk about the Drought Monitor. How does that actually impact our farmers and ranchers, especially our ranchers?
A number of ways. First of all, we look at the KBDI Index, which is an index that looks at the relative possibility of fire, and it looks at the ground, how dry the ground is in the first 10 inches and the vegetation above. the way that affects the farmers and ranchers, first of all, grass isn't growing. And people right now, they're talking about, well, do I plant my ryegrass or not? Do I drill it in or do I wait? Because you need that moisture right afterwards. And the other thing, if you look at all the plants, as you've been traveling last year, you see the leaves starting to curl up, you see the wind blowing, and we've had 122 fires so far this month, over 500 acres. And we're getting a lot of fires accidentally. In the last few days, we have had a number of fires. One, because a pickup truck was going down the highway after dark and had a chain dragging, and it set over 10 fires. Another one was another vehicle that had a piece of metal off the back, and it was touching, and I think it also had blown out a tire, and that rim, on a dual trailer was sparking. It caused another 10 to 15 fires. So just some sparks on the side of the road, then it can get into the pastures and into the timberland. So right now, and I've been visiting with a number of our farmers, our crawfish farmers are concerned, because what happened, if you remember last year, we didn't have enough water at the critical time when we have to flood the fields. And so far, I was, just down in the Chico Aquifer, I was in Jennings, and so this water there, it hadn't started pulling up salt. But if you remember last year, they ran out of water, period. And that resulted in a loss of 100,000 acres of production. So we're very concerned. We're right there on that edge. Now, we've been harvesting very, very well. And I think you see, like with cane, harvest is going well. We need a little bit of moisture. I'd like a little bit more tonnage, but we're going to be cutting the ratoon crop. We've started cutting the ratoon crop of rice. Then we got to flood those fields for crawfish and for ducks and other things. So, and then of course, as this moves into the first part of spring, remember, we plant when the soil temperature is right and there's moisture is right. So this is really the second year in a row of very unusual weather patterns, and we're watching what's happening. In Africa, with the intertropical convergence zone has shifted north. There's lakes in the Sahara, and then we've seen what's happening with all these storms where there's very different weather patterns, and so we are dealing with this. But these maps are important. If you look at the Drought Index, that is what the USDA and private insurance companies, the insurance companies that farmers take out private insurance, they use that map for the designation of the degree of drought and the time of the drought per degree as far as making payments. So these indices are very important. And the fact is we're seeing drought, and I have farmers calling me on the way here. They're calling me and said, look, they say I've got enough moisture here. That's not true. It is worse than bone dry.
Yeah, this affects people's pocketbooks, their livelihoods. And you brought up about last year's drought. I'm going to ask both of y'all this same question, and I'll start with you, Commissioner Strain. Have we recovered from last year's drought?
No, we haven't. And because, one, like with crawfish, that'll take several years. That is not something you can do in 1 year, because we have to reestablish those crawfish in more than 100,000 acres, reestablish them in, the wild population in the basin. But then again, it takes several years to reestablish that. And so our farmers took a pretty big lick last year. And so it will take some time. Now, what the second thing we have beside the drought, we have weak commodity prices, especially in corn, beans, rice, in that order, and in cotton. And so that's another thing. So besides having lower production due to the drought and all those other issues, now we have low commodity prices. And I'm working with our bankers, but we've got some serious issues in the farm community when you got those two things together.
And from a meteorological standpoint, climatological standpoint, have we recovered from 23? Is the water table back where it was? Because that's a conversation I've had with Amelia Kent, it was her property that a couple of those fires started on.
Yes.
that burned some posts on her property. She's saying that, she's just not seeing ponds to the level they used to be.
Well, that's still the case. I mean, when we're talking about the upper and middle soil layers, they've recovered for the most part. But when you're talking about getting that deeper moisture down into the layers that are going to help recharge water table, that takes years. So, and that's especially a problem when the withdrawal rates go up because it's not raining. So that's a double whammy there. You've got a falling table because it's dry, and then you've got use of that water table because it's the only source of water. So that could take decades to recover in a very dry year like that. The other thing to think about, and our sort of our number one crop, if you will, is the impact it had on forestry. And that's going to take more than a year to recover as well, because just trees don't respond to just 6 months of rainfall. In terms of surface water flow, for the most part, we had recovered until we've hit this dry run again. That should get back close to normal as we get into the winter, depending on how dry the winter proves to be. We're rolling into a La Nina, more than likely. That tends to make for drier than normal winters, but still in normal La Nina years, we do get enough rain in those winter months to sort of make the environment happy, to break even in terms of the moisture demand by the vegetation.
Jay, you brought up about forestry, and one of the things that we've seen a lot of are more dead trees. The drought stressed the trees, which then allowed beetles to go in and kill a lot of these pine trees. Commissioner, are you seeing that when it comes to the fire risk? Because those
Absolutely.
dead trees...
We've got more than 14 million trees on the ground. And what we've seen, and a lot of people have experienced a lot of intermittent power losses where the limbs are falling or the trees are falling, and they're everywhere. And so what happened with the extreme drought, a lot of those pine trees and some hardwoods died as well. But now we're going into a year two where we're starting that drought again. And so those that were on the edge, and you can see them starting to brown up, towards after when we finally got some rain, you could see the forest greening up a little bit. Now it's browning up again. And we have some areas, especially you get into the western part of the state, southwestern and western, those are areas that were traditionally over time part of the Great Plains. And we planted those trees on areas that was normally by nature grasslands. And so those trees, which are not native, are struggling in this environment. And so if we get hit hard with another drought this year, I think you're going to see some secondary effects because these trees are weaker than they were before. And we have got a tremendous fuel load on the ground. And that's why we're very, very aggressive, with these burn bans and telling people do not light that match, because with all that fuel on the ground and as dry as it is, we could see a return to some of those massive wildfires.
I believe at this point we're at 28 parishes that are under burn ban across the state?
The majority of parishes, according to the map I see now, are under a burn ban.
Yeah, I think it's well over 30.
Yeah, and it's parish by parish. We tell everyone, call your local government, okay? And call your local government, and do not light that burn pile. Don't light anything. Check with your local government. But again, we need to be cautious now because we're fighting, again, a record number of fires day to day. When you start fighting 10 or 20 in a day, and we have seen last February, we had up to 60 in a day, single day across, the state. And you can see the wind. We got a little wind out there today. It's blowing the leaves. That's all really nice. However, that will push a fire at a rapid rate. And if you think about, we got an 8 mile an hour wind. Now you think about a fire running over your head at 8 miles in an hour. That's what that means. And so we've got everybody on standby. We got our planes in the air. We've been fighting these fires. We're asking everyone, really help us. Do not light that match. Don't light that match. Wait till it rains, right? And it's all clear, because as dry as things are, you may not think it will burn, but the grass around that brush pile will burn, and we're seeing a lot of the fires we're seeing are secondary to debris piles burning.
And in terms of staffing for your fire crews, y'all run pretty lean.
We run very lean. We have 150 firefighters. We continue to have more training academies. We are rebuilding our equipment fleet with some new equipment and rebuilding the fleet. But this is what you got. We got 150 firefighters, and that's for the whole state. That's for the entirety of the state. And so if you get up to 60 plus fires in a day, and you got 150 firefighters, right? And so one of the things we have done, we've implemented, we now have a dispatch center, which is adjacent to our emergency operations center at the office. And we can see where every machine is, where every person is, where every dozer is, and all of that live time, so we can better coordinate, especially when we get down to our last dozer. And so we're working together for better coordination. But again, Everyone has to work with us, because if you remember last time when we had the battle for the town of Maryville, Tiger Islands, where it started, and that jumped up to about 36,000 acres. But for the first 5 days, it was us. And the National Guard came in, on about the 5th day. By the 10th day out, we had 1,000 firefighters in Southwest Louisiana, all engaged in these fires. And we had over 50 miles. Now you think about 50 miles of fire lines. That's like from here to Lafayette. That's the fire line, with all those men and women working. And so it was something that like you've never seen in a generation or generations here in the state. That hadn't been seen since 1942, when we lost 1.2 million acres, or 1924, when we lost 5 million acres. We held this to 63,000 acres. And every acre is precious, but you see that it was so dry, and those firestorms, it created firestorms that created their own atmosphere there. So if we get a little rain, it would rain around the fires, but not on the fires. And those flames would go hundreds of feet in the air, because all of the sap would volatilize. You could smell it. Smell like alcohol and turpentine mixed together, and it would just explode. And so we don't want to see a return of that.
Well, Jay, you're still relatively new at GOSEP, but you've been the state climatologist before. You've worked in weather all of your career. In terms of the drought, and in terms of your position now, how much are they leaning on your knowledge at GOSEP in terms of ways to respond to the current situation?
Well, the response is outside of my area of expertise. I mean, that's what the commissioner and his teams do. What I try and do is just paint the picture. And as the commissioner is pointing out, this isn't just let the state government handle it. The only way we're going to do this properly is by getting the citizens, the residents, to do the right thing. And sometimes that means not only not burning that trash pile, but maybe not that backyard little fire that you used to normally have, because all it takes is a couple of embers to sneak away. And with the breezes we've got, and it is probably drier out there than you recognize, even in your own neighborhood. So we're at I would say, a critical point here in terms of being able to maintain and limit the spread of any fires that do develop. I was unaware of the number of fires we're already seeing at this stage, but that gives you an idea, 120 fires plus.
Right.
I mean, this is, and so that's, for the commissioner, that's one fire per firefighter. I mean, he's already maxed out there, and it puts a burden on the volunteer fire departments as well that are out there in the community trying to manage all of this. So my role with GOSEP is just to keep them appraised of where the status is in terms of the drought. GOSEP will kick in on a sort of a next level of alert and activity if we start to see bigger fires breaking out.
You mentioned about every citizen needs to be involved. I know Louisiana Farm Bureau purchased rain gauges and weather stations and distributed them to 4-H and FFA groups across the state to help them report to the Drought Monitor, what's called the Condition Monitoring Observer Reports, CMOR for short. How much does that help, Jay, in terms of helping, I guess, Lincoln, Nebraska, where the Drought Monitor is housed? How much does that help them and paint that drought picture? And what can the average person do?
Well, the first thing is to make sure that your local authority is aware of the situation in your little area. Because one of the things I hear a lot is it is much drier in my farm plot than you're showing on your map. Well, and that's very possible. We're going to have spots that are even drier than the regional picture is. So CMOR, the program you're talking about there, as well as any ancillary data that gives us a sense of dryness, certainly helps. In terms of the Drought Monitor, it's not going to change the status of the drought, but a lot of decisions are being driven by this Drought Monitor. So the more input we can get from the locals to provide to the Drought Monitor authors. And keep in mind, this product, we have a team here in Louisiana that provides input each week on what we think the map should look like, but it's a national author that makes the final decision. And each of the last 2 weeks, and I know it's going to happen again this week, the national authors have been resistant to our wanting to increase the drought threat, the state of drought in Louisiana. So as we get more information from folks from individual parishes and localized communities, it gives us more horsepower to go back to these national authors and say, hey, wait a minute, no, it's worse than you're projecting here, worse than you're showing. And that has bearing on things like availability for funding and assistance. So it's a much bigger deal than simply how dry is it.
Yeah, you mentioned that your team thinks that hasn't necessarily agreed with what has been in the drought monitor. What do you think or does your team think it should look like?
Well, last year we had a big problem with this. In fact, the commissioner was very active last year in trying to get the drought monitor up to speed because, again, it's not just about a map that shows us where it's dry and where it's drier. It's a map that literally triggers funding opportunities and funding mechanisms. So this year with our team, we're trying to stay closer to what we perceive as reality in Louisiana. We feel right now that the drought monitor map is maybe a week, possibly 2 weeks behind the curve in terms of what we perceive to be the reality. Now, keep in mind, last year when the commissioner got involved, the drought monitor was probably a month or more behind.
Or more. Stagnant.
And so
yes.
we've resolved that, and now the issue here is really a matter of a little bit of fine tuning. I think we're on the right track now. We've got the right people in place, and I've reached a point of almost pestering the authors, but I think they're starting to listen. And we've now got a one-on-one dialogue with some of the national authors there who are beginning to say, okay, I see what you mean. What they're doing is they've got a playbook too. And then just like Major League Baseball, there are rules. And they're telling me that pitch wasn't in the strike zone. And I'm saying, yeah, your strike zone's a little too small. Let's widen it out a little bit because I've got not only producers, but livestock people, foresters. Everybody is screaming bloody murder. It clearly is drier out there than your national tools are showing. And I think some of this is the fact that, as the commissioner alluded to, much of the country, the growing season is coming to an end. Mm-hmm. Ours never ends. We go from one thing right into another. And so I think there's a sense maybe with some of the national authors that are mainly from the central and northern states that, what's your problem down there? Well, the problem is we've still got more agriculture. Our agricultural wheel never stops turning. It just changes as time goes on. So we're trying to point out to them that you can't use your rules in Nebraska and Indiana and South Dakota down here in Louisiana.
Yeah, that we play by some different rules. So while you're kicking dirt on the umpire's shoes, Commissioner, I understand that some people could be sending photos and posting photos to help with that.
And we're working together, and I want to thank Jay for all of us working together and accepting the role of state climatologist, because what we're doing now through my office, we created the Department of Meteorology, and what that is for is that through all of our different offices, our forestry stations, others, we are collecting data, and we're also making sure that those remote areas, Keachai, DeRitter, on the military base, all that data is working to get to, the drought authors. So they're getting a lot more data. They're getting a lot of data, and we're checking data, and so that we know on the ground what is there. We're asking farmers for photographs, show us what your ponds look like, but we're also putting up those weather stations. We're using some federal grants and others to where we can have more accurate data that is scientifically based so that we can continue to work to make sure that this drought monitor is as accurate as it can be. Maybe we're flooding it with too much data, but you know what? It's coming.
There's never too much data as long as it's good data. And I think that at this point we've kind of we've worked through what's useful, what is not. I think we've got a great game plan here with the commissioner's team and with the state climate office and the Ag Center at LSU. So we've now got the core to keep our thumb on the pulse of the drought monitor, and we're sometimes bringing out the whip and telling the authors to get with the game. I think that I would like to say that I think we've done a great job with the Drought Monitor, but the proof will ultimately be in the pudding and with the commissioner and how the ag community responds to what we've been able to do.
I know that Louisiana Farm Bureau leaders have been very engaged and involved in this, from trying to get more reporting to working with the State Climate Office and you, Commissioner Strain. So, Louisiana Farm Bureau is here to help in any way in which we can help get the word out. So, final thoughts as we wrap up this podcast. Commissioner Strain, any final thoughts for people to keep in mind and do going forward? What's the call to action here?
The call to action is everybody, keep sending us data. We appreciate everything you're doing. Please work with us as we get through these situations. But, if you think that your farm is drier than the one next door, that could be so. If you've ever flown with me in those little bitty airplanes, you see what a rain cell is like. It's right here, but it's not right here. And it never rains here, but it rains here, So you can have within just a few miles a different situation depending on those scattered rains. So we need those long soaking rains, as we say, to get, things a little bit better. But we're going to continue to work with this as a team to get the accurate information, also to work to make sure at the end of the day, the USDA, as well as the private insurers and our firefighters have the right information to know what we're dealing with.
And Jay, final thoughts and call to action from you.
Following up on what the commissioner said, just the first thing is we're probably not going to see the severity of drought we saw last year, although I think there's some measure of sort of agricultural PTSD here. Folks still reacting to last year and thinking that we're back on the pathway there. I do think as we get deeper into the winter, things will slowly start to improve, but don't look for any big turnarounds. Even with the rain we're going to get over the Halloween period there, that's only a start. It's going to take a while to recover. We'll probably be into the spring before we get into a good rebound. Hopefully the spring rains will be something close to normal, bring us back to at least a good starting point to jump off as we get into March and April. But certainly any kind of information, as the commissioner said, that you can provide helps us paint the picture and just alert the rest of the state of just how bad things are. There are places in Louisiana that it's not bad. South of New Orleans, they're doing fine. But most of the rest of the state is in a pretty bad situation right now.
Well, we appreciate that you're in this situation, Jay, to help guide us through it and make sure that we all know what we need to know. Jay Grymes, State Climatologist, Commissioner of Agriculture and Forestry, Dr. Mike Strain, thank you all for being on the Louisiana Farm Bureau podcast.
Thanks for having me.
If you would like to check out anything that we've mentioned here, we'll have it in the show notes, namely the Seymour website, the U.S. Drought Monitor, and a little story I did kind of giving you the history of State Climatologist Jay Grymes. He and I go way back to 1999, not that I'm trying to date him or myself, but we are so thankful that you joined us for the Louisiana Farm Bureau podcast. We'll catch you next time.